Thanks for joining us for week 2 of the Formed.Life as we continue in our John series. Last week, we looked at Jesus feeding thousands of people in the wilderness with basically just a Lunchable. And when people saw what Jesus did here, feeding thousands of God's hungry people in the wilderness, they recognized him as the prophet. Jesus is the prophet like Moses who miraculously feeds God's people in the wilderness. And the people want to make him king right then and there. But Jesus gets out of there. He runs for the hills, literally. He withdraws to the mountains. Why? Because Jesus won't be king without the cross. That was the temptation that Satan offered to him at the beginning of his ministry, that he could be king if he would just worship Satan and he wouldn't have to go through the cross. But Jesus has been trained in the wilderness to resist that temptation, and he's able to resist that now with the crowd. And so he goes to the mountains alone. The disciples don't go with him, though. They head back across the lake known as the Sea of Galilee. And John describes the scene as they go. Darkness falls, the wind rises, the waves crash uncontrollably. Now we have darkness, a chaotic raging sea. Where else in the Bible do we read about that? It calls our minds back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Darkness and watery, chaotic depths is how you describe the unordered world without God's ordering, life-giving presence. But then the disciples see Jesus walking to them on the water. The chaotic sea is literally being put under the feet of King Jesus. And John tells us that they had already rowed 3 or 4 miles. That puts them in the very middle part of the sea at its widest point. Now, at an average walking pace on land of about 3 miles an hour, that would have been about an hour-long walk for Jesus. I'm not sure what the average walking pace on water is, but there Jesus is, and they are terrified. And of course they are. Like, they're about to drown, and now they have to deal with a ghost too. Great. And in their fear, they do not recognize that it is Jesus with them. Why is that? Well, as one of my favorite John scholars, Herman Ritterboss, put it, they had never learned to know Jesus in that way, and thus, in that place, in the horrendous situation, had not expected him at all. Let me say that again. They had never learned to know Jesus in that way, and thus, in that place and horrendous situation, had not expected him at all. But Jesus is with them in that place, just as the Spirit was hovering over the water in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And Jesus speaks, I am, don't be afraid. I am, don't be afraid. They didn't expect God in that place, but Jesus was there anyway. As Ritterboss explains, no darkness was too deep, no waves too high, or sea too wide for him to find them and be with them in the midst of that tumult. Which leads us to our key question for this week. Where do you need the king over chaos to say, don't be afraid? Where do you need to hear the king over chaos say, do not be afraid? Where do we as God's people together need to hear, do not be afraid? Where are you not expecting Jesus to show up? Start looking for him there. Have a great week.